Good morning and welcome to the 2026 AAAS Annual Meeting SciMic stage, supported by the George Washington University. This is being presented in person here in Phoenix and is also being streamed online at AAAS's meeting YouTube page. I am Jessica Hubbard and we're going to continue on with our slate of interviews this morning. Here I have Megan Jennings, research scientist at San Diego State University. Welcome to the SciMic stage.
Thank you so much for having me.
So tell me a little bit about yourself.
So as you said, I'm a research scientist at San Diego State University. I'm a conservation ecologist. I've also been a land manager. I worked in land stewardship for over a decade, doing all sorts of things, and I carry all of that into the work I do in conservation ecology.
And will you be talking a little bit about that in your session that is later today, correct?
So the session was yesterday.
Yeah, okay.
So the session was really focused on one particular project that we're working on, and that's with tribal partners. But I'll sort of say, at San Diego State, I co-direct this Institute for Ecological Monitoring and Management, and the tagline of our institute is Science in Service. And that's really sort of the message of everything that I do, is how can we provide science in service of decision-making, of action, how do we move forward from a place of information in this decision-making to conserve land, conserve biodiversity, to manage land, and also that's evolved into thinking about climate resilience. And that's really what the project that I talked about in my session is about climate resilience in California, because it's something that comes up a lot. We have to deal with it a lot. If anyone was here and heard the keynote or the president's address on the first evening, she talked a lot about some of the issues that we have in California related to climate.
Taking a step back, if we can you go into when you first realized you wanted to pursue your line of work? Or?
It's been an evolution, really. I started out from the time I was a very, very young child. I loved animals. So I'm actually a wildlife ecologist.
Oh, nice.
Turned more into a conservation ecologist, and now I do a lot of climate adaptation work. It's been this evolution because I felt a real connection to the natural world and to wildlife. And, when you're a kid, you don't know what job opportunities are. So, do I want to be a vet? Do I want to work in a zoo? And then I realized that wildlife biology is a thing, and you can do that as a career. And so I eventually worked my way there. But then as I'm doing that work, in particular, some of the work I do is on connectivity planning. How do we make sure the areas that we're conserving are well connected so animals can move between them?
Right.
And I was doing some of that work, and we had a connectivity plan, and I went to a partner who happened to work for a tribal government that I had worked with in the past, and I said, do you think the tribe would be interested in what we've mapped out here in the data? And she said, Megan, it's not that I don't think they'd be interested, but there's so many other priorities. I think it would be more important to them to know, if there's cultural resources there, right? If they're important cultural sites and artifacts, that sort of thing. And that's when it struck me that we really need to be thinking about who are we trying to talk to, who's working on this together, and is there an angle where we accomplish the same goal, but we might be talking about it in different ways and holding different values that help us still get to that same place. And so that's really informed a lot of my work moving forward, is that idea of not just talking to ourselves, so conservation ecologists, not just talking to conservation planners, but talking to everybody, because we're all in this together. And I actually think a lot of the challenges we face, in particular around climate in California and elsewhere, is because we now have this disconnect between our human landscapes and natural landscapes, because we think about them as separate, but they're inextricably linked.
And there's a lot of interdisciplinary work that's involved in this, right?
Absolutely. Everything I do is interdisciplinary. Work with geographers and engineers and ecologists. Through this work with tribal communities, working with folks who are in American Indian studies, working with jurisdictional planners and people who focus on that, right?
Right.
Getting out of your comfort zone, getting out of what I personally know, and working with others who know other spaces.
You mentioned kind of an evolution of your career. So and we, again, have a lot of students who are attending this conference. So for any of those who attended your session yesterday or maybe listening in now, what advice would you give if they saw this and think, wow, I want to do something like that as a career?
I think the thing I would say most is I attended a number of these Southwestern Tribal Climate Change Summits that some partners of mine at the Climate Science Alliance host. And in one of the early ones, there was some hoop dancing and storytelling, and the moral of one of the stories was, speak once and listen twice. And I think that's really important. I carry that with me everywhere that I go, because when you have, when you're trained in the Western academic world, we're taught that we're training to be experts. You should speak up. You're the one who holds knowledge that is valuable to other people. But we're not the only holders of knowledge. And knowledge, there's more than one type of knowledge. There's more than one way of knowing. And so in working in spaces with tribal practitioners who are stewarding the land and have stewarded the land since time immemorial, there's a deep connection to place. In working in land stewardship, I found this myself, right? You come to know a piece of land, and there's so much information that you can glean just from being there. Not necessarily collecting data, but with what you see and what you experience every day. And so I think that's in part what I've carried with me, and what I would advise others to think about is that while yes, you're trained to be an expert and you do have knowledge, it's not the only type of knowledge, and it's not the only valuable piece of information.
Right. And I feel like you've answered this a little bit already. I've been fortunate to interview so many people, and I've absorbed a lot of advice, and you just gave me some, so I appreciate that, and our listeners. But is there any other advice that you've received that has stuck with you in your line of work?
Yeah, I think part of it's related to the story that I mentioned in terms of
yes.
having someone say to me, this might not be valuable in this way, and so I think it's that type of advice, thinking about what am I doing and who is it for, and did I talk to that person, and did I ask what they needed, did I ask how it could be useful, and so I spend a lot of my time, as I said, I started out doing wildlife work.
Right.
And now I mostly work with people. And that's really important in this work. I do very applied science, but in applied science, there's a lot of solutions looking for problems. And it's because we're not taking the time in some cases to start with defining the problem with the community. And so that's in this work that we're doing. In the session that I was in yesterday, I was talking about a climate action grant that we do with tribal communities, the Collaborative of Native Nations for Climate Transformation and Stewardship. That's a mouthful. We call it Connects. But really, that was resourcing our partners who were already doing amazing work,
right,
to take climate action that was informed by research we had been doing together that coupled Western science with traditional ecological knowledge. So I think it's this idea of making sure that you're, again, this listening twice and only speaking once, hearing what people need and how you can best meet them where they are, because communities know how they can best respond and be prepared and be resilient to climate change.
And a very important skill to have, right?
Absolutely. And it's a hard one, right?
Yes,
like we don't get trained in, I don't actually like the term soft skills, but in science we're not often trained in the soft skills, but it's something I do a lot. And it takes time and practice, and it's about relationship building.
Right, right. And that might be an unexpected skill to have, if that makes sense. Has there been any other skills important to the success of your work that people might not expect?
Yeah, I think, that listening and the asking and how you do it, how much information and how you deliver information, right? I would assume that almost anybody here could fire hose somebody with all sorts of knowledge about, the stuff that you know really well.
Right.
But it doesn't land when you do that. And so how much information and what's the right kind of information and what's the delivery mechanism that's really going to get to somebody so that they feel empowered to use that information that you're sharing and working on together. Like that is a skill that I'm still developing, but it's sort of thinking about what do people need and really listening
right
to people.
Really well said. Moving on to what I'm calling the final phase of the interview. We do a lot of science as scientists, but we also have other aspects of our life that are important. So I've been asking folks, what are you reading right now, or any other hobbies that you'd like to share with listeners?
Yeah, well, as I said, I started out in all of this because I love wildlife, I love the outdoors. As you move on in a career, you spend less time out in the field and more in front of a computer. So I try to make a point of getting out to hike. I do hold on to parts of projects where I can make sure I still get out in the field. As many scientists, I actually have an artistic side, and I love music. So I hold on to that. But in my reading right now, it's actually really interesting. I'm reading The Invention of Nature by Andrea Wolf about Alexander von Humboldt. Considered the father of ecology. And it's interesting because I've also, slowly, bit by bit, been reading Tending the Wild by Kat Anderson about how Native Americans in California stewarded the land. And it's interesting the dichotomy of like how, in sort of a Western and colonial perspective, Alexander von Humboldt was coming to these conclusions that have been, held in the kin-centric view of landscapes and how interconnected people and landscapes are amongst tribal communities. Like,
Right.
coming to the same conclusion, but through a completely, separate process.
Right.
And just, I think it emphasizes how there's a lot of opportunity to learn from indigenous communities if you're listening twice and speaking once.
Are there any final thoughts? I feel like that's a great final thought, but is there anything else that you would like to convey to listeners here in Phoenix or listening in online?
Sure. I think I would say, don't be afraid to get out there and engage with people. I think in science, we are taught to communicate with each other, but if it's uncomfortable to you to figure out how to communicate to the general public, I think we're in a moment where that's really important, that we figure out how to do that better, and it takes practice. So start with friendly audiences, but get out there and practice. If you're not comfortable with it, work with people who are. I spend a lot of time working with people who say, I don't know exactly how to do this, and I say, it's okay, we'll do it together. You know the science. I can work with communicating and help with connecting with people, but those connections are really critical to the work we do.
Back to interdisciplinary
Absolutely.
connections, right?
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for joining me today on the SciMic stage. I really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.